That was kind of feeble. Can we try that again? Good evening. Yeah, all right, you're good. I am very excited about December 7th at 10 a.m. We have been praying about this as a board for more than 2 years and talking together about the fact that the strategic next step for Smoky Hill Vineyard is to move into a dedicated space that would allow us to worship on Sunday morning. And to see that come together is a real answer to prayer, and we're very grateful about that. I am wrapping up our series on the move, where we've been looking at the book of Acts. And the focus for tonight is when God comes near. And I want to draw some lessons on suffering from the life of the Apostle Paul. Scott Peck, in his classic book, The Road Less Traveled, begins with a 3-word sentence: life is difficult. And Jesus pretty much affirmed that in his conversation with the disciples in John chapter 16 when he said, "In this world, you will have trouble." And some people choose to cope with the difficulties that life brings our way by adopting the advice of America's beloved philosopher, Charles Schulz. In the words of Linus, spoken to Charlie Brown, who said, "No problem is so big or complicated that it can't be run away from." And I would say only if life were that simple. But on a more serious note, I want to begin with a question that you may never have been asked before, and perhaps have not spent a lot of time thinking about, but it's a serious question, and here it is. What is your theology of suffering? And some of you are thinking to yourself, well, happy Thanksgiving to you too, Steve. Way to get the week off on a great start. But I'm serious. What is your theology of suffering? Maybe another way to say this that could be a little bit easier for you to process is, how do you make sense of suffering in a way that reflects what is true about life and is true about God? And I have come to believe that the reason most Jesus followers, at least here in North America in general and the U.S. in particular, the reason why most Jesus followers don't have a well-articulated theology of suffering is because we have a flawed understanding of the nature and character of God. A.W. Tozer, in his classic book, The Knowledge of the Holy, opened the book with this simple sentence. He said, "The most important thing about you is what comes to your mind when you think about God." Let me say that again, just because I want you to just kind of marinate in that thought for a moment. The most important thing about you is what comes to your mind when you think about God. You see, our perception of God is like a spiritual lens that colors everything else about your faith journey, including how we understand and how we respond to suffering. And I would suggest to you that there are 3 prominent myths that have captured the church here in the U.S. in particular, myths about God that affect our thinking about suffering. Let me highlight them for you. The first myth is this: if God is good, then life should be fair. Now, that's not a true statement, and it's problematic because we know that life isn't fair, and it calls into question the character of God. Because sometimes evil people prosper and good people suffer. Asaph, who authored some of the Psalms, wrestled with this. He wrote about it in Psalm 73, verses 12 and 13, and said this: "This is what the wicked are like, always carefree, they increase in wealth. Surely I have kept my heart pure in vain. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure. In vain have I washed my hands in innocence." Maybe you've had that thought one time or another. You probably, all of us, have firsthand experience with this dynamic of life where it just doesn't seem fair. Maybe it's that person at work that you know is cheating, and the person with the lowest integrity that gets the promotion, maybe even instead of you. Or it's the drunk driver who walks away harm-free from a horrible accident, and the innocent person is the one lying in a hospital bed or worse. The second myth is simply this. It's the idea, if I like it, God won't let me. These are misunderstandings about the nature and character of God that affect our understanding of suffering in life. If I like it, God won't let me. This is a totally mixed up understanding of God. This myth is why so many Jesus followers wrestle with the idea that if I totally surrender myself to God and yield completely to His will, that He's going to make me do something that I don't want to do. In fact, I've had so many conversations with younger people in particular over the years who have this mixed up understanding of God, and they want to surrender to Him, but because they don't trust Him and they're thinking to themselves, if I totally yield myself to God, He's going to make me marry someone I don't want to marry. He's going to make me go somewhere that I don't want to go. He's going to make me do something that I don't want to do. This is often wrapped up in this crazy idea of, he's going to make me go to serve somewhere in Africa. Don't look at me like you have no idea what I'm talking about. You've probably had thoughts or feelings like this. The reality is this is not the nature of God. The third myth is simply this: if it's hard, God won't ask me. This is a misconstrued understanding of God that suggests He loves us so much that He would never ask us to do something that could put us at risk or in danger. We know that people in the Bible and in the history of the church, walking in obedience to God, did experience risk and danger, whether it's Daniel or his 3 friends, or Queen Esther, whose famous line is, "If I perish, I perish," when facing the possibility of standing up for her own people. We've come to believe that there's some kind of a statute of limitations on this kind of surrender and obedience to God. We're inspired of stories of sacrifice and suffering as long as they happened a long time ago or if they're happening a long ways away. I remember a friend of mine who I got to know when my family lived here in Colorado. She was telling me about her brother. He and his wife were serving as missionaries in Pakistan. And on one particular Sunday morning, they were at an international church service in the city where they lived in Pakistan, and it was her brother, his wife, and their baby. And she was holding their baby in the service. And a Muslim terrorist came to the church and threw a couple of grenades inside the building. She was sitting on the aisle and heard something and just instinctively turned, and the explosion caused shrapnel into her back. Thankfully, the baby was okay. She was injured, but not so severely that she couldn't recover. And my friend told me that when the people who were, some of their supporters who were helping to support them to go to serve in Pakistan, criticized them and said, "Why are you putting yourself in a place where something like this could possibly happen to you?" These were people from their supporting church who were asking these questions. And my friend told me, she said her brother said to them, "We weren't there on vacation. We were there out of obedience to God." So I would say to you, we need a theology of suffering. We need to be able to make sense of suffering in a way that reflects what is true about life and what is true about God, because we live in a sinful and fallen world. There was no sin in the garden until there was no suffering in the garden until sin entered the world, and there will be no suffering in eternity, as confirmed by John's vision in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4, where we are told he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. We long for that day, don't we? But until then, as Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, because God has overcome the world. Well, the Apostle Paul understood all of this. He understood suffering from both sides. He was the one causing the suffering in the beginning of his story. And maybe you remember Paul on the road to Damascus in modern-day Syria, arrested by Jesus, who appears to him. Paul, blind, is taken into the city, and a message is given to a prophet by the name of Ananias. And here's the message God gave to Ananias to give to Paul as he is waiting for what God's message is for him, still blinded from this experience that he had on the road. And Ananias, the part of the message he was to give to Paul was this. This is what God said to Ananias. I will show him, Paul, how much he must suffer for my name. Acts chapter 9, verse 16. And this was not metaphorical suffering. This was real suffering. Paul recounted some of the suffering that he experienced in his letter to the church at Corinth. Let me just highlight a little bit of what Paul had to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 24. He says this: 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? That's a pretty remarkable list. And when Ananias told Paul that God is going to reveal how much he has suffered in his name, I don't think he could possibly imagine this. What I find fascinating about this little description of the suffering that Paul endured that he recounts here in Acts chapter 11 is that the only thing in this list that actually we have record of in the book of Acts is Paul being stoned. Everything else in this list we would not know about from the book of Acts if Paul didn't tell us here. Now you say, wait a minute, didn't he say shipwreck 3 times? Yes, he did. This was written before Paul was shipwrecked later in Acts, which means there's a 4th one added to this suffering resume. So Paul understood suffering for sure. And reflecting on Paul's experience with suffering, it can help us maintain perspective on our own life. But there's a danger sometimes in looking at something like this from the life of Paul, because we think to ourselves, well, nothing like that has ever happened to me, and pray to God that it never does, and it's probably not going to happen to me. And so if there are people who have suffered like this, and there are people suffering today in different places around the world, is it even right for me to bring my first world problems to God and somehow expect that he would care about it? Yes, it is. This is not some kind of a one-upmanship while you have to try to figure out in order for you to be worthy of God's grace and mercy and presence in your life, that you somehow have to outdo others who have suffered in some way more than you. Here's the main lesson that I think we can learn from Paul's experience with suffering. This is the big idea that I want to give you tonight. When God allows suffering, it is not about increasing our pain. It's about increasing his glory and advancing his kingdom. God is not the one who is putting suffering into your life to somehow increase your pain. But he allows, at times, suffering in our lives to transform us more into the image of Jesus, to advance his kingdom, and to glorify his name. This is the core message that Paul gives in 2 Corinthians in the very next chapter, chapter 12, where Paul talks about one unique aspect of his suffering. Chapter 12, beginning in verse 7, Paul says this: "To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me.'" Verse 10, "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong." God is glorified in our suffering when it grows our character and makes us more like Jesus and advances his kingdom and brings glory to his name. His power is made perfect in our suffering weakness. This is Paul's testimony to the church in Philippi, where he was writing to them from prison, and he said, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." And so Paul, from his own story, is highlighting the fact that God was using the suffering he was experiencing to advance the gospel. So let me bring you back to our understanding of how our understanding of God affects our theology of suffering. You see, God is so sovereign, so awesome, so majestic, so transcendent that he doesn't have to cause something to happen in order to use it to transform us into the image of Jesus, advance his kingdom, and bring glory to his name. The fact that God knows in advance something is going to happen doesn't translate into the fact that he is the one who is causing it to happen in our lives. Foreknowledge does not equal causation. And so when you encounter insults, Shandos talked a little bit about that last week, didn't he? The rage that seems to be so addictive in our culture. When you encounter insults, hardships, difficulties, even persecution, the most important question that we can ask is not, why is this happening to me? This is our instinctive, reflexive, go-to question. Why is this happening to me? But rather, the important question is, God, how are you going to use this to change me more into the image of Jesus? How are you going to use this to advance your kingdom here on the earth? How are you going to use this to bring even more glory to your name? Now, that's not an easy journey for us, I acknowledge. And it's not a one-time sort of a fix. It is a process that we have to walk out time after time. So I want to zero in on one specific moment in Paul's life where he experienced suffering and how Jesus met him in that time and what we can learn from that experience. So take your Bible, if you have it with you, or your phone, or I guess those are probably the only two options, and go to Acts 23 with me. I'd like you to look at this passage, Acts chapter 23. Paul had an experience in Acts 23 during a visit to Jerusalem that provides a wonderful picture of the character and posture of God when we are experiencing suffering. Now, the backstory here is that Paul is visiting Jerusalem. And while he's there, he is falsely accused, which is probably a form of suffering that you might relate to, where somebody's accused you of something that you didn't do. Paul's falsely accused of desecrating the temple by bringing a non-Jew, a Gentile, into the part of the temple that only Jews were supposed to go to. He didn't do this. In fact, he had gone way out of his way to accommodate the strict Jews in his visit to Jerusalem. Don't have time to go into all the backstory. But Paul had gone way out of his way to demonstrate to the Jews in Jerusalem that he wasn't turning his back on their history with Moses in embracing Jesus, who was the fulfillment of the law. And so he was falsely accused. Not only was he falsely accused, but when he was accused of doing that, it caused people in the crowd to become so angry at somebody who would be so crazy to do something like that, that this mob began to attack Paul. And they were beating him so violently that a Roman soldier who was there felt like the only thing he could do was arrest Paul in order to save him from the mob. And after he's taken into custody by this soldier, Paul asks for permission to speak to the crowd. He convinces the soldier to let him talk to the crowd. And so he begins to try to explain to them why he's in Jerusalem, and he's giving them an understanding of the gospel. And in chapter 22 and verse 21, Paul says, "Then the Lord said to me, 'Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" Verse 22. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." Let me just give you a little inside information here as somebody who's had a tiny bit of experience in public speaking, that when the crowd says that in the middle of your talk, it's a sign that it's not going well. So the soldier has to intervene again to save Paul's life. Paul tells the soldier, this Roman soldier who's taking him into custody, Paul explains to him, by the way, just as an FYI, I'm a Roman citizen, which gave him rights that this soldier would not have expected Paul to have. He didn't think of Paul as a Roman citizen. And so it was a bit of a change for how he was going to be treated. And so Paul was then given an opportunity in chapter 23 to speak to the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, the Sanhedrin. And Paul gives a talk to the Sanhedrin. In chapter 23, verse 9, there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Can you see a pattern developing here? Multiple times, Paul's life is saved by people who were trying literally to kill him by a soldier who arrests him, and this time he is placed in the barracks, the Roman barracks. Chapter 23, verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Now, in this one verse, I believe there are 4 powerful truths that we can learn about the posture and nature and character of God in response to human suffering, in this case, the life of Paul. So here we go. Number 1, first thing we can learn, God knows where you are. Verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul. You see, no matter how alone or isolated you might feel, God knows where you are. David put it like this in Psalm 139, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast." In times of difficulty, in suffering, one of the lies of the enemy is to tell us God has abandoned you. You're all on your own. And the reality is, as clearly demonstrated by Paul's experience here, Jesus came near to Paul. You see, there is a difference between the omnipresence of God and the presence of God. There's a difference between God being everywhere and God coming near. And the verse says, the Lord stood near Paul. And no matter how you feel, the Lord will be near to you as well. So, number 2, God knows how you feel. The very first words that Jesus spoke to Paul were, "Take courage," and if you notice in the text, it has an exclamation point after it. Can you imagine Jesus showing up in this Roman barracks? Paul has had all this crazy stuff happen to him, and Jesus shows up, and the first thing he says is, "Take courage!" exclamation point. Now, why did he say that first? Some translation of this could be for Jesus to simply say, "Paul, cheer up." Now, why did he say that? Because God cares about your emotional state when you are experiencing hardship and insults and difficulties and persecution, any kind of suffering. God cares how you feel. I'm not trying to turn Jesus into some kind of a spiritual Tony Robbins who's just going to give you some kind of a pep talk, but neither is he a military drill sergeant who's just going to show up and shout in your face and say, suck it up and get in line. That's not it. He cares how you feel. The emotional side of suffering is real. There's a reason why the most common description of Jesus when he saw people on the earth who were suffering and hurting and in some kind of pain, the most common description the Gospels give us of Jesus in those moments is he was moved with what? You say it. Compassion. Why? Because this is the nature of God. And when you are experiencing suffering of any kind, not only will he be near to you, but he's coming close to you with an acknowledgement and a recognition of the emotional state that you are in, with a desire to bring comfort, moved by your circumstances with compassion. Number 3. God remembers what you have done. In this verse, Jesus said to Paul, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem. This is a very interesting part of the message that Jesus gives to Paul. It's interesting because Paul had a number of different experiences in the city of Jerusalem. He went there after his conversion, and he began testifying about Jesus, and nobody believed him. They were skeptical of him, and he was eventually run out of town. He went back to his hometown of Tarsus. And every time after that, where Paul would come back to Jerusalem, he would engage in ministry that would result in people trying to kill him. Paul's ministry in Jerusalem, the word that would characterize it is not success. The word that would characterize it is suffering. And yet Jesus is acknowledging Paul's ministry in Jerusalem, even though he saw no fruit whatsoever. You see, part of our problem is when we're experiencing suffering, we think if my ministry hasn't been producing some kind of visible fruit, that Jesus isn't going to care about me. And that's not true at all. This was about Paul's faithfulness and his obedience in the face of hardship and difficulty. Jesus commended him for his faithfulness. 4 separate times in his commendation of the churches of Asia Minor, recorded by John in the book of Revelation, Jesus said to those churches, I know your deeds. And you might feel like a failure. You might feel like things are not producing the results that you longed for. But God has a different kind of scorecard. Number 4, God controls where you're going. Your future is in his hands. Jesus said to Paul, so you must also testify in Rome. As you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify about me in Rome. Paul had come to believe that a part of God's purpose for plan for his ministry was for Paul to go to Rome. He had already talked openly about this in Acts chapter 19, verse 21. And yet here he is, after having been nearly killed multiple times, locked up in a Roman barracks. And God says to him, so you must also testify in Rome. You see, God knew it would be important for Paul to have this assurance because of the additional suffering that was yet to come. And Paul would leave this barracks in the dark of night because 40 people took a vow, a solemn vow, to said, we're not going to eat until we've killed Paul. And the plot is discovered, and the Roman soldiers sneak him out in the dead of night, and he spends 2 years in the Roman city of Caesarea. He will eventually head to Rome, where on the way he has a shipwreck, the fourth one. He washes up on the island of Crete, and he's bitten by a poisonous snake, but he doesn't die. You see, God knew Paul would need the reassurance that his future was in God's hands, not in the hands of those who were trying to kill him. So let me circle back to the big idea. When God allows suffering, it's not about increasing our pain. It's about increasing his glory and advancing his kingdom. And the important question isn't, why is this happening to me? The important question is, God, how are you going to use this to shape my character, to make me more like Jesus? How are you going to use this to advance your kingdom? How are you going to use this to bring even more glory to your name? Trayvon, if you want to go ahead and bring the band and come up, we're going to worship in a few moments. But let me just end. I want to share a story of a friend of mine. I met him in a very unusual set of circumstances. He goes by Izzy. He's from Mexico. I met him at a mall about 10 miles from my house in a suburb of Atlanta. I was there with my best friend and my son and my friend's son. We had gone to a movie. We were looking, got some food afterwards, and we were looking for a place to sit down in the food court. And there really weren't places for us to sit where all of us could be together. And there was this young Hispanic man sitting at a table by himself with enough seats for us, and he welcomed us over. And so we went over and sat down next to him, and in his broken English, within the first 3 or 4 minutes of us sitting down, he starts sharing the gospel with me. And I said, wow, I love Jesus just like you. I'm really curious. Tell me more about your story. And he said, well, my church in Mexico sent me up here to be part of a program to learn English because I need to learn English before I can go as a missionary to India. I said, wow, I need to know you. You got to come over to my house for dinner. He goes, well, I don't know if I could do that. I said, no, really, I want to make plans. I want you to come visit me. And he goes, well, I have a roommate, and my roommate, I wouldn't feel comfortable, coming without my roommate. I said, well, what's up with your roommate? He said, well, he's from Panama, and he's in the same program as me. He's learning English so that he can go as a missionary to Afghanistan. I said, well, now I need to get to know you and your roommate. You both have to come over to my house. And so Izzy and his friend started coming over to my house, not just for dinner, but for prayer. And I had multiple prayer times with these two young men where they were literally laying face down on the carpet in my living room, weeping and begging God to open the door for them to go to a very hard place to serve. Well, to fast forward, a number of years went by, and my friend Izzy was back in Atlanta for a visit. And he's sitting at my kitchen table having lunch with me and my wife, and he's telling me about some of his experiences in this part of South Asia where he lives, high up in the mountains. And he was telling me about a day that he was trekking way up into the Himalayas. And he said, My legs were burning. My lungs were on fire. It's raining. And he said, I'm saying to myself, I'm an idiot. What in the world am I doing here? This is just craziness. I should just turn around and go back. And God just spoke to him and encouraged him to press on. And so he looks up, and there's this woman working out in the fields, in these rice fields on this plateau. And he said, she looks at him and she goes, what are you doing here? She's speaking to him in their local language, and he can understand enough to talk to her. And she says, what are you doing here? This is not a tourist area. And he said, well, I'm not a tourist. And she said, well, then what are you doing here? And he said, I came here because I wanted to tell you something very important. She said, well, about what? And he said, about Jesus. And she said, I don't care about Jesus. But there's a girl in a village nearby. She wants desperately for somebody to talk to her about Jesus. And my friend Izzy, he said, will you take me to her? And she said, well, not tonight. It's an hour away. It's dark. But you can stay here tonight, and I'll have somebody take you tomorrow. The next day, they took him an hour trek to this nearby village, to this girl. She was about 18 years old. And he said, I've been told that you wanted to know about Jesus. And she said, yes. He said, why? What happened? She said to him, when I was only about 6 or 7 years old, I had a serious fall and I hurt my leg and I couldn't walk at all. I was crippled. And someone came to our village and prayed for me in the name of Jesus, and I was healed instantly, and they left. And she said, I have spent every day from then until now asking God, would you please send someone here to tell me, who is this Jesus? And my friend Izzy, sitting at my kitchen table, pushed his plate forward and leaned over to me, and he said, Steve, I looked her in the eye and I said, I am here in answer to your prayers. And that day, that girl gave her life to Jesus, and that girl started a church in that village, and the gospel is advancing. Now listen to me. My friend Izzy told me on the way up there, legs burning, lungs on fire, rain pouring down, he was this close to saying, I don't have to endure this suffering anymore. I've already done enough. I can just turn around and go back. But somehow God enabled him to press forward just a little bit. And here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes in the midst of suffering, we are this close to a Holy Spirit empowered breakthrough that will shape our character, that will advance the kingdom, that will glorify God, and we turn back right before the breakthrough happens. And if you're here tonight and you're experiencing something that the enemy has brought into your path, I'm asking you, will you please hold on? Would you please allow Jesus to come near to you tonight? Because he knows how you feel, and he knows what you've done, and he controls where you're going. And so as we worship for these last few moments tonight, would you just open your heart and receive the strength that you need from Jesus to press on? Let's worship together.